Greetings, College Baptist, on this Maundy Thursday. You know, as Christians, we live our lives at the command of King Jesus. The word Maundy is derived from the Latin mandatum, which means mandate or command. And it was on a Thursday long ago that Jesus gathered his closest disciples, the 12 apostles, one last time before his arrest. And on that Thursday night, he hosted a Passover meal, and he commanded his disciples to love one another. And he did this even as he was about to lovingly lay down his life at the cross of Calvary the next day. So on this Maundy Thursday, I'd like to reflect on the tangible love of Jesus and his commandment to us to love one another. You know, one of the things that I will miss most this Easter is the opportunity to gather with family and friends for Easter dinner. I won't go hungry because Rachel will make sure of that, and because she's cooking and I'm not, it's sure to be good. So I'm not at all concerned about the cuisine. But I will miss being with others. I'll miss eating with loved ones. Now, I'm sure that we'll FaceTime and phone call with relatives during the day, but it won't be the same as crowding around the table, as passing a plate of ham. Here's a note from your Michigan Pork Producers Association to put some pork on your fork this Easter. And it certainly won't be the same as holding hands for prayer around the table. Now, when we gather around the table, we recognize that the table is a place of tangible love. Someone lovingly worked to earn the money to buy the groceries. Someone lovingly slaved over the stove. And someone lovingly set the table. We understand, we appreciate that the table is a tangible expression of love. We get that in the 21st century, and the same was true in the ancient world, maybe even more so. And I think this was particularly the case for Jews who gathered around the table each spring to celebrate the Passover meal. They did this as a reminder of God's saving love for them. And without going into great detail, you remember that the Passover feast was established by God to remind the Israelites of how he had miraculously rescued them, saved them from slavery in Egypt. Now, the main course of the Passover meal was a lamb. And this lamb was a tangible, symbolic reminder that a lamb had been slain in each Israelite household, and that the blood of that lamb had been painted on the doorposts of the home. And according to Exodus 12, as a result of this act of faith, sacrificing the lamb, painting its blood on the doorposts, the Lord would pass over the door and would not allow the destroyer to enter their houses to strike the firstborn in that 10th and final plague in Egypt. You see, the people of Israel were the recipients of God's tangible, saving love. And so they set a table, the Passover table, year after year after year, to remind them of God's saving love. Now in Luke 22, verse 15, we hear Jesus say to the apostles while gathered around the table, "I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." Jesus lovingly desired to eat with his beloved followers. Now, to be sure, Jesus had enjoyed lots of meals with his disciples through the years. Fish on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, meals at the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, and even a feast at the house of the once despised tax collector, now turned generous Christian Zacchaeus. But this meal, this Passover meal, was something special. It was the last Passover before Jesus would suffer at the cross. And Jesus took this opportunity to repurpose the old covenant meal of Passover and use it as a reminder of his tangible new covenant love. And isn't it interesting that Jesus doesn't focus on the traditional elements of the Passover meal? Jesus instead focuses his attention on the bread and on the cup. He famously says about the bread, "This is my body, which is given for you." And he then says of the cup, "This is the cup that is poured out for you, and it's the new covenant in my blood." Jesus was using this meal to foreshadow what would take place in the coming hours. His body would be given as a substitute for sinners like us. Just as a lamb had been slain as a substitute for the firstborn Israelite, so has Jesus given his body as a substitute for sinners. Though we should have received the wrath of God for our rebellion, Jesus gave himself. He lovingly endured the punishment of God for us. And his blood would be shed as the ultimate expression of his new covenant love. As we've learned in our study of Hebrews this year, the old covenant was built on the sacrificial system of the temple. And in the temple, the blood of animals was shed repeatedly, over and over and over, to satisfy the wrath of God. But it only had a temporary effect. In contrast, Hebrews 9, verse 12 tells us that Jesus entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. Body and blood. It doesn't get much more tangible than that. And I want to tell you, if you have ever wondered about Jesus' love for you, you need to look no further than the cross of Calvary. As the kids' song reminds us, Jesus loves me. This I know, for the Bible tells me so. As the Bible tells us in Romans 5:8, God most perfectly demonstrated his love for us at the cross of Calvary, the cross on which Jesus died for us while we were still sinners. That, my friends, is tangible love. And it is the tangible love of Jesus that compels us to love one another. In John's account of this last Passover meal, we hear a command that's not recorded in the gospel according to Luke. In John's Gospel, chapter 13, verses 34 and 35, we hear this: "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Now, the commandment to love isn't really anything brand new. After all, loving God and loving others is the perfect way to sum up the 10 Commandments, according to Jesus. But Jesus gives this commandment in a new, fresh sort of way, like a reminder. And he empowers and instructs us to love others by his own example. So in a world that thinks that love is an emotion or a feeling, in a world that has reduced love to a romantic encounter, Jesus reminds us, no, love is a tangible expression of sacrifice. And when you know that you have been loved perfectly by the tangible love of Jesus at the cross, you're freed up to love others in sacrificial sort of ways. Who is God calling you to love today? To love in the week ahead? As I said a couple Sundays ago, doing good starts at home. It starts in the workplace. Are you loving your parents? Husbands, are you loving your wives as Christ loved the church? Your children are watching. Wives, are you loving those kids? Moms, are you loving those kids when they're on your last nerve? Are you loving your roommates even in these close quarters? And are you exhibiting long-suffering love to your coworkers over Zoom meetings and conference calls? What could you do to go out of your way to love others in response to the command of Jesus? And don't forget that the world is watching. Maybe even, especially now, to see how Christians will love one another in this present crisis. I was thrilled to see that the Christian organization Samaritan's Purse International Relief has set up a field hospital in New York City's Central Park. That's tangible love for others. And it's something for all people to see. Christian doctors and nurses will share loving medical care to anyone. Anyone who is wheeled into those tents will receive the love of Jesus, regardless of their sexual orientation or their gender identity or their religious beliefs or the color of their skin. Why? Because the love of Jesus compels them. And let's not forget this, College Baptist. Hillsdale is watching. Are we showing love to one another and to our neighbors during this crisis? Are we showing love that the average non-believer will see as a picture of Jesus' sacrificial love for us and for them? As I mentioned a couple weeks ago, we are good, and I thank God for this. We are good at loving one another in this household of faith. But let's be equally good at loving our neighbors and even our enemies. And by this, may all people know that we are disciples of Jesus. College Baptist, may the love of Jesus compel us to love as he has commanded us. God bless you, and may God be gracious and compassionate to us.